Is that a fair way to frame it?
That's a fair. I mean, bad science is always like tricky
Oh,
term.
I love the use of the term bad science. So run with it.
Hello and welcome to The Stream, an unscripted, unedited, free-flowing conversation featuring guests who reject the status quo with a bias for action in the world of water and beyond. My name is Tom Freyberg. I'm an environmental journalist and content creator specializing in water.
And I'm Sarni, a water strategy consultant, doing my part to solve wicked water problems.
And today we are thrilled to be joined by Bessie Schwarz, who's the co-founder and CEO of CloudStreet. Bessie, how are you? Great to see you.
Good. Great to be here with you guys.
Thank you. Well, listen, we've got lots and lots we want to talk to you about. As a kind of young female entrepreneur in the water climate tech space, in the kind of the flood tracking management impact of climate change. I know we can go 1,000,001 directions with this conversation, but I think just for the purpose of the listeners, give us a kind of brief intro of kind of who you are, and we'll hopefully get on to the sort of the origin story of how you came to co-found the company.
Yeah, happy to. And yeah, it's great to be on this podcast. I've heard it a bunch of times over the years since you guys got it started. So CloudStreet, I'm the CEO and co-founder, and we're a climate adaptation AI platform and the authority on tracking floods globally in near real time and analyzing flood risk as it changes at virtually any pixel on Earth without requiring ground equipment. So what does that actually mean? Essentially, we have a system that uses AI in order to stream all relevant satellites, about 15 different satellites, optical, microwave, radar, down to about 30 centimeters. Combine that in order to just map floods where they're happening anywhere around the world, but also bring in local gauge data, some of the traditional data sources for hydrology, community intelligence, and lots of other forms of big data in order to get a complete picture of flooding that is happening now, flooding that is likely to happen in coming years or decades, and flooding that's about to happen. So that's the technology that my co-founder and I, Beth Tellman, started working on about 10 years ago or so, in partnership actually with Google, back in kind of their early days of satellite cloud computing. But today we have about a little bit more than 22, I lose count, national governments primarily on the platform using this information for search and rescue, disaster management, and reducing their risk. They use it at kind of any given rainy season. They're monitoring about 320 million people around the world who are at risk of flooding, and doing things like relocating refugee populations by the thousands who we've identified are in the floodplain. And then about a year and a half ago, we began working pretty closely with some global insurers, reinsurers, and brokers in order to design disaster risk financing and other types of insurance on this same technology, so that we suddenly could underwrite insurance and provide disaster capital to virtually anyone, anywhere, to help them finance the actual disaster resilience that they need.
It's interesting, when you're introducing the company, you purposely say climate adaptation, right? Mm-hmm. As opposed to, I mean, obviously you're tracking flooding, tracking water, perhaps the impact and the result from climate change, but it's almost your position within that climate tech adaptation resilient space as opposed to a water technology software.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I also think, so one of the big differences there is the difference between analytics and adaptation and what it takes, and that kind of pretty big gulf in between. And to me, the difference is how much you support decision-making. Whereas we really believe that the solution that my co-founder and I set out to focus on was a data gap. And we really believe that all adaptation, disaster management, and a lot of empowerment to more vulnerable communities around the world began with access to high quality information, but it certainly does not stop there. And so while we are kind of first and foremost began as essentially a research lab, we never intended to stop by just throwing data over the wall and basically like saying, good luck about this. In fact, most of our users don't even look at the maps. They don't even kind of look at or think about the analysis. They just want, in many cases, all those millions of pixels, all of the, like, it was 80,000 CNN processed satellite images that we just sent over to some folks in order to create one WhatsApp message that says, this community needs search and rescue right now because there's X number of people who are in danger. Like, that's usually what they want, and support with that decision making. And so it really does come down to how far into support for those decisions. And while really respect a lot of our close partners and colleagues who are firmly in the analytics space, we are very firmly in our mandate goes beyond.
And Bessie, this is great to hear that it's not just a data dump. Essentially, it is translating this into actionable information for your customer base. What are you seeing in terms of actions? So what does that look like at the, the government level, insurance companies, potentially even private sector, multinationals that are very focused on building sustainable and resilient watersheds, communities, and supply chains?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot in what you just said, and in order to survive this thing and adapt to just the amount of warming we have baked into the atmosphere today from just flood impacts, we've got to work with all of those sectors, and CloudStreet will, but we're extremely focused at the moment. So we work with governments and humanitarian organizations, primarily in the developing world, and alternative risk transfer insurers and reinsurers all over the world. So we're very focused on those folks. So I'll answer the question for those, although I have lots of thoughts about how we eventually move into de-risking the supply chain from water and climate, et cetera. So maybe I'll give you just a quick example on kind of two ends of the spectrum from both of those segments. Our longest standing partner that we're kind of still on the platform is the Republic of Congo. And I bet you don't know today that the Republic of Congo is one of the most, if not, I would argue in many ways, the most advanced flood information informed government and humanitarian sector around the world. And this has really happened over the course of just a couple of years, in part because of need. And I think there's an interesting story in what I'm saying about how countries you don't expect to be leaders and how we adapt actually are going to be, similar to how you can just leapfrog past the landline. So in 2017, go way back when, in the Republic of Congo, a kind of medium-sized flood hit a northern part of the country, fairly rural, but a really important area in terms of bringing resources from the northern resource-heavy northern part down to ports in the south. Medium-sized flood hits, but the national government doesn't know about it for 3 weeks. And by that time, there's a couple of thousand people who don't have access to food and are majorly impacted. And they have to declare a national disaster and go respond to this. Luckily, no one died in this particular event, but it was a severe impact on the local economy and livelihoods. So they realized, okay, we're 3 weeks before just knowing that we need to provide some kind of relief, search and rescue. And so we basically got a call after that that said, like, is there a better way possible? The problem in the Republic of Congo, which is quite common around the world and even in a lot of the US, they had a couple dozen local gauges, river gauges, stream gauges across the country. Not enough to really have a decent understanding of what's going on there, but they all of it had been wiped out during conflict in about the 90s, and it had been struggling to rebuild this back since. So a year after that event in 2017 and 2018, the next rainy season, we had set up an all satellite-based information that was streaming in this first year, just public satellites. So keeping it pretty low cost and tracking every inch of the country every day, looking for water. So over the course of that first rainy, so suddenly they're going from 3 weeks to we can tell them every day what's happening around the country and is there an event. And we know there are a bunch of like smaller events that happened here and there, and we were working with the government to show them what was going on. Nothing major. And then at the very end of 2018, a fairly large migrant community moved into refugee camps along the river, kind of forcibly. And we got desperate calls saying, is this a flood? Like it's already we're in the middle of the rainy season, the rivers are rising, we can see on the ground, is this going to be a problem? And we pretty quickly not just looked at the near real time, but we looked back in time through our risk analytics all remotely and said, actually, one of these 4 camps where about 7,000 refugees are living is a highly vulnerable area. We would recommend we should relocate. They used that data in order to move them. And a couple of months later, there was a major flood that happened. Those rivers did rise, and a lot of that area was pretty devastated. They've then moved on to using there was a major flood that's happened in many of the years since, and they've used the system to pretty quickly identify something's happening, we need to act, and that actually get like many millions more dollars for that relief that they need to do. So yeah, that's kind of the one extreme end of the example on the disaster risk management.
And Bessie, again, turning this into actions and recommendations as opposed to here's the data, have fun,
yep.
Is the value added piece of the puzzle here. Who funds you? So is it a mix of development banks, national governments? Certainly the insurance side is pretty straightforward, but who are the initial customers when you went to market that said, okay, this is really high value, it benefits us, it benefits our ecosystem of stakeholders?
Yeah. So you have it exactly right. So it's a mix of humanitarian organizations who often pay the kind of the first year subscription and the setup, and development banks, governments, and then insurers who will often take over a lot of the financing for just the analytics and obviously for the disaster risk financing after. Our very first customer we got before we even had a business or really understood what that was, which was the World Bank.
Okay, that makes sense. And this might be the appropriate moment to segue into how did you get started? Like, why? It sounded like this was a research project that became a passion, became a commercial business. But if you can sort of go back to, your aha moment that, boy, this is something the market needs and people will actually pay for it.
Yeah, great question. So my background is in climate change, and I've always set out to focus on creating a livable future and one that is more equitable. So that's really the motivation behind CloudStreet, and it really comes from trying to solve that problem. And this is a particular avenue. CloudStreet is a particular avenue for doing that. But we have a very distinct mission that is the thing that we are building. And a multi-billion-dollar valued company is an end to that particular means. And it really comes from my background working in communities in the US. This is going back many, many years now, who clearly weren't getting the protection that they needed in the face of growing climate disasters. So we're talking about, I started my career working with young people in coastal Florida who knew they were going to have to leave where their family had been for generations if they didn't get protection. Many of them have had to leave since the time that we are working together. Or low-income farming communities in the Midwest. And it was pretty clear to me at that point that a lack of information meant that they couldn't advocate for what they needed. I'll say that simultaneously, my co-founder was having somewhat of a similar kind of realization of very different context. She was working in El Salvador, where there were communities that were left off of disaster aid lists after major disasters when they had been, in many cases, like destroyed by those. They were left off because they hadn't been predicted to be in the hurricane path, and then they were kept off because of local corruption, because essentially mayors of certain towns wanted the aid money for them and not for their neighbors. So she spent a couple of years just doing resilience building in specific communities that hadn't gotten that support, and realized she wanted to, similar to me, go back to the deeper source of the problem and fix the bad science that had them off in the first place, and lack of access that kept them off.
So this is, I mean, there are a number of things that are interesting in what you just said, but the bad science and lack of access to data and actionable information. So, one of the things that we talk about a lot is democratizing access to data and actionable information. So you are collecting data and pushing that out to people that absolutely need it, that historically might have had to go through, a regulatory agency or some other entity that perhaps had their own agenda. Is that a fair way to frame it?
That's a fair. I mean, bad science is always like tricky
Oh,
term.
I love the use of the term bad science. So run with it.
Yeah, I think I think the source of bad information, or the reason that a community, a company, a government doesn't have high quality data, which, I mean, I don't think it's controversial to say in the US, the most flood gauge country, we still have like our maps are terrible here, flood maps.
Bessie, you can say that. Yes, yes, we're analog, we're primitive.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely like kind of appreciate the like honesty around it. I guess like our approach at CloudStreet to disruption, if you will, is that it really isn't about kind of throwing out the past science. So hydrology and like the past approaches that we've used are quite effective when they can be done well. There are many things that I would just use a model for over our approach, but then we've really reached I think the limits of what kind of flood information we can get out of it. So the real solution is to combine and use all of these approaches.
So Bessie, would you say, I mean, firstly, a really interesting story from Congo. And I think in terms of the lives saved, that's incredible value of what you're offering governments. And, I love the purpose in terms of offering something for vulnerable governments and democratizing access to actionable data. But from looking through your kind of earlier videos and where you're going, it's not just the satellite data combined with the AI. I think maybe you could talk a bit about this. It's combining that with, say, crowdsourced data, with input from, say, social media, from people tweeting. I was going to say twittering, but tweeting certain images and data points, right? I think that's like what you bring together, and that social science element. And we've touched upon this before in the stream. It's highly interesting to kind of paint that real-time picture. So maybe talk about how you bring something from the ground combined with satellite data to kind of provide that insight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a key point in terms of just what the actual goes into the information, and then what kind of decision science has to be taken into account as you deliver your product and build up solutions for a country, for a community, et cetera. So yeah, the first point is while a constellation of satellites is oftentimes kind of we think of as the backbone of coverage for near real time and then near term risk, it has to be complemented with models, with information on the ground, whether that's news scraping, social media scraping, that's actually crowdsourcing. So we'll use, for instance, the field responders, the first responders in the countries that we're working with, will just submit right onto the system that they're using, or maybe just in literally WhatsApp channels that we have in most of the countries that we're working in, a picture of a flood happening over here. or a data point from someone that they know or they heard. And that all gets into the system as ground truthing in order to improve the system that we have. And if you think about that, a data point from the Congo, it's like I'm picturing in my head a picture of from a first responder of a guy who is like exiting and like trying to get out of his house because there's flood on water. That is a data point that we use for that location, the cross streets. Improves the algorithm, not just for the Congo, because our algorithms are global, that improves the flood maps we have in California and the flood maps we have in Colombia. So getting that information to say, okay, your map missed some flood water here because the water was really muddy, it didn't look blue or whatever. That's going to improve everything, not just in California today, but every detection we have in California, which leads to which is what creates our risk analysis. And then you get that in a near real-time stream that just continually improves itself.
Because not every image not a personal image from a smartphone of a flood is going to be the same or like for like. So by feeding this thing with data, it gives that subjective element, different light conditions, different coloring of the water. Yeah, that's really clever. So maybe talk a bit more. I mean, yeah, I totally get the purpose and the personal vision with the climate change background. But you mentioned earlier on about the end goal is kind of having this, multi-billion-dollar software company. It's a perfect time to reach that aspiration. Talk to us a bit about the sort of day-to-day entrepreneurial journey then, Bessie, in terms of, with the co-founder, the relationship kind of growing, bringing investors on board. I'd love to kind of hear about it's a roller coaster, right?
The messy part.
Yeah. Give us some of the kind of the unseen parts of the CEO of CloudStreet.
Yeah. I mean, well, there's so much. There's certainly so much to say about that. I guess I'll kind of jump in by really saying that we actually waited a very long time to do a seed round, to raise venture capital money. Mm-hmm. And I think venture capital money for a mission like ours can be incredibly powerful. We would not be able to build the technology that we're building now, especially the insurance piece of what we're doing.
Right.
But we waited a really long time, like a painfully long time. And like mostly the painfulness was watching like investors say, this is a bet, why are you waiting so long? Or clearly you're growing too slowly, and so then you'll never be investable, that kind of stuff. But we had a really strong conviction, I would say was really just gut level in many ways with us, with the team, that we wanted to first prove that the science actually worked, that this way of flipping the script from the ground up to the cloud to the street for hydrology analysis actually worked. And we didn't want to just prove that it worked because we had convinced ourselves fairly early on. We wanted to prove pretty dispositively to the rest of the scientific community that this was a real and new form of hydrology that was going to fill gaps that were not possible previously. So that was the first thing that we wanted to prove. And then the second thing is we wanted to prove basically product market impact fit. So we wanted that impact piece before we put fuel in the fire. And really put that kind of pressure on, because we wanted to be able to say, first of all, to ourselves, we're not just kind of BSing here. We're not just saying like, oh, wouldn't this be wonderful if the world was climate resilient because of, AI? But we wanted to actually not just know that it was real and that we weren't just talking, but know how that actually worked, like the mechanism of what it takes to get like a refugee population relocated. Or disaster risk capital to a farmer in Colombia, or a supply chain de-risked in China. We wanted to understand what that actually looked like, so we knew what we were scaling. And yeah, pretty proud today that on the first thing, Scientific Authority, we were our science was the cover of Nature over the summer. Lots of credit to my co-founder Beth Tellman and our founding team member Colin Doyle on that one. And we actually released all of the data behind that analysis, which is just free on our website for folks to use. And then we now have stories like not just the one that I mentioned from the Republic of Congo, but others like that all over the world. And so we're pretty proud about exactly what it is that we're scaling. And now, frankly, thrilled to be kind of on the VC track and like love our investors at Lower Carbon, Collaborative Fund, the folks over at Floating Point, who are the founding team from Oscar Health, and really feel like we all know exactly what it is we're building.
Well, kudos to you and the team, I think, for perhaps bootstrapping the early phase and waiting until the time was right. And I think when you're disrupting the status quo, often patience is a bit of a virtue, but unfortunately the early stage investors, as you mentioned, they want to see growth and scalability very early on. So you had to resist that. Perhaps investors telling you what to do to hold firm, to prove the science. And you're in a market that's perhaps saturated with AI digital solutions and software as a service right now. So by waiting and proving, I think you did absolutely the right thing.
It sounds like, a big part of this, and we hear it more and more, is it's the right VC.
Yeah, totally.
Right VC community that, they certainly want to return, they've got their own investment thesis, but they believe, they believe in the team, they believe in the value proposition, they believe in impact. That alignment is absolutely critical in the scheme of things.
Yeah. Alignment, yeah, I completely agree. Alignment is key to really everything, like incentive alignment, right. Alignment, but it is extremely true with investors. And different investors, just like different team members, are all coming for slightly different reasons. Like the mission is the same, everyone's clear about that. But we have, and we intentionally built on our cap table, both like we have Mercy Core Ventures on our cap table, and we did whatever it took to like carve out room to have this very socially mission focused investor on the cap table who understands disaster risk financing in the developing world better than pretty much anybody else. But we also have high growth, pure money making, care about climate change, probably in their personal lives, their firm, probably doesn't, on the cap table as well, because we really need to prove that both are true. Like I'm under kind of no illusions about what it means to be a for-profit capitalistic company and what we're trying to build here. And we know both the massive strengths of that, of what it's going to take to get adaptation globally is going to be a multi-billion-dollar business that has to be profitable and very lucrative to get to that scale. And we're also really clear about what that does not do and what part of the change we are not creating and the partners that we want to bring on to help complement the work that we're doing, kind of where our theory of change ends. And with that, we're just fully aligned in the sense that we don't have the exact same goals as the investor in many ways, but our goals are perfectly aligned.
I love the blended investor mindset, which is both need to be true at the same time. It is the mission-driven, organizations coupled with the, want to say hardcore, but very financially return-focused venture funds. That's incredibly powerful as a brand message in the marketplace.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. I'm pretty proud of kind of getting to this point, also because I think it's the strategic thing to do. And let me tell you, I think a lot of social entrepreneurship is a lot of vapor. And I actually think probably is either more of one than the other. It's truly just a money-making scheme that has they whatever on brand on top of it.
It has a wrapper around it.
Right, which is fine. But I have a kind of a social entrepreneurship advisor who basically says, unless it deeply impacts your decision making, unless you are making trade-offs in which impact is a deep component of that, if you can't point to a decision where you're like, you know what, we change this because of that, and vice versa, then it doesn't matter kind of what you're doing or how good the brand is or even what it is that you're doing. That's just inherently not a social impact company.
It makes perfect sense.
Bessie, so we've only got a couple of minutes left. I know you've got to dash to another speaking engagement, but what's next? if we say we had you back on the stream in a couple of years' time, what does sort of it's
Like,
been a crazy freaking couple of years in terms of 21 and the pandemic and everything, but we've just seen from the IPCC report that's come out in terms of confirming data on climate change from a scientific level. I mean, what does this year, what are you hoping to do this year?
Yeah, so if you think about something on the scale of, what IPCC just said again, this thing is, the emergency is growing even more, and we can do something, but the margin is getting much smaller for the kind of laziness we've had so far. What I really think about now is how we finance this, and specifically how we finance adaptation. How do we finance, in some ways, what some folks think is less glamorous, I think is more glamorous, the work of just doing prevention around the disasters that we know are coming and reducing our risk overall. So I'll just say that, let's go back to the Republic of Congo quickly. So way back many years ago, when we would sit with ministers, the top ministers at the country, and say, look at this technology. In fact, let me pull it up on the screen here. We can see that, there's a flood happening right here. This is a real thing. And they would say to us, with what additional money do you expect us to go do all of this work?
Right.
And we don't solve that part. So this is going beyond just having the data to make the decision, having the support, as we were talking about earlier. None of that actually will add to anything unless you have the resources to do that. And so we became very clear that we wanted to solve that at a fairly global scale as well. So the answer could no longer be to this minister, I don't know, no options for you. And so I'm really excited about the work that we've been doing with some big insurers around the world in order to just offer, in many cases, a insurance to the national government for the exact decisions that they can see they need to make on our platform through our analytics. And then we're also working with banks to help do debt relief to loan holders in their portfolio. And I think a lot of really creative financial instruments that are essential to getting the right people, communities, governments, businesses, the capital that they need at the moment where they're vulnerable from a disaster, and then give them the confidence to become more climate resilient and invest more in prevention.
That's really interesting. So even not a shift in your business model, but you're not just providing this data to the vulnerable governments of where the risk is coming, but actually opening the doors and the connections to where the finance to make the change happen is needed.
That's right. Yeah. And we're excited about it going both ways too. Right. So definitely what we think of kind of all of the government's humanitarian organizations on our platform, but also think of you guys yourselves and your listeners or their community or the business that they work at as risk holders. You all hold risk around climate change. You all hold significant amount of water risk. All of that is transferable to another risk holder halfway around the world, or a different type of risk holder. And that really is what insurance is, and the kind of safety net that they can provide around the world. And so we're thrilled about bringing that kind of a system to the very first segment that we've been working on, the governments and humanitarian sector, who we really see them as the front line of climate change. Now bringing in many cases, some of the richest companies in the world, in the reinsurers that we work with, to help be part of that solution to them. And then, to your point earlier, going sector by sector with this. So we can do supply chain risk, literally today across China, if we wanted, and large property holders and real estate, or the US government eventually.
That's a great follow-up opportunity in terms of the private sector opportunities, and what they're looking at, what they're investing in, and how they're collaborating with national governments and communities in where they operate.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this basically has to hit every sector and I will just say that the one we are really, really excited about right now is actually banking. Think of the amount of just loans and debt around the world that is at risk of just default from climate change. Is there a way, okay, we're not going to stop that. We're not going to relieve this amount of debt. We're also not going to reduce that risk of that debt. These will go default. There are more and more things that are literally going to go underwater. let's de-risk that by just through these insurance metrics. And this product works, and it makes sense for the banks, and it makes sense for you.
Brilliant.
This is a follow-up conversation or two, Bessie.
Great.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to have you back on in a year's time to see how bringing in the banks and the insurance companies and connecting them to governments is playing out. But listen, really appreciate your time and the expression that me and Will always use as a bias for action, and we certainly think you've got that in building CloudStreet with the purpose and vision you've got. So thanks for your time, Bessie. Really appreciate it, and good luck for the continued mission as well.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me on. This has been really fun.
Great to have you on. Thanks, Bessie, and thanks for what you do.
Awesome. Cool.
Great. Cheers, Bessie. Thank you.
Talk to you later.
See you soon.
Be well. Bye.